The decision to tell my family I didn't believe anymore didn't happen overnight. It was years of questions building quietly in the back of my mind. Moments where the answers I was given stopped making sense. Growing up, faith was presented as the foundation of everything. Morality, purpose, identity. You weren't just expected to believe, you were expected to believe without question. But questions don't disappear just because you're told not to ask them. They grow quietly, in the spaces where the answers don't fit. I started noticing contradictions in the stories I was taught. The way an all-loving God also seemed jealous and wrathful. The way prayers went unanswered no matter how sincere. The way entire groups of people were condemned while we were told God's love was universal. For a long time, I kept those questions to myself. It felt dangerous to voice them out loud, especially with family. Because belief wasn't just about religion. It was about loyalty. To doubt was to risk being seen as rebellious, ungrateful, even broken. And in families where faith is central, losing belief isn't just personal. It's treated like betrayal. The actual moment I decided to say something wasn't planned. It came after years of quietly playing along, going to church, bowing my head at prayers, pretending to agree when faith came up in conversations. That pretending wore me down. Each time I stayed silent, I felt less authentic. I wasn't lying outright, but silence felt like lying too. The trigger was small. A holiday dinner where someone at the table confidently said that people without faith can't truly be moral. I felt the heat rise in me because by then I knew I didn't believe, and I knew I was still moral. I cared about kindness, fairness, honesty, compassion, not because of reward or punishment, but because they matter here and now. In that moment, staying silent felt impossible. So I said it, not with a speech, not with anger, just with honesty. I don't believe anymore. The words landed like a weight in the room. For a few seconds, everything stopped. Forks paused halfway to mouths, eyes turned toward me. Then came the questions, the shock, the disappointment. The silence gave way to attempts to convince me I was wrong. Telling my family was one of the hardest things I've ever done, because it wasn't just about belief, it was about identity. For them, my disbelief felt like a rejection of everything they valued. Traditions, morals, community, even love. The idea that someone could live well without religion didn't fit into their framework. The responses came in waves. First denial. You're just going through a phase. Then guilt. What did we do wrong? Then fear. If you don't believe, what happens when you die? Each response revealed how deeply religion shapes thinking. My family couldn't separate belief from morality, or faith from meaning. To them, rejecting belief looked like rejecting life itself. But here's the truth. Leaving belief didn't strip meaning away. It gave me more. It freed me from fear of hell and guilt over doubt. It opened space to value the present, the tangible, the real. And it forced me to find morality in empathy, not in obedience. In those first conversations, I realized how unprepared my family was to hear dissent. They had spent their lives inside a closed loop where belief was assumed, reinforced, and celebrated. To them, faith wasn't an opinion. It was a fact. And I wasn't just disagreeing with an opinion. I was challenging their reality. I tried to keep my tone calm, not mocking, not aggressive, just steady. Because I wasn't trying to win an argument, I was trying to show them that disbelief doesn't make someone immoral, broken, or lost. I shared examples, how I still cared for others, how I still valued honesty, how I still found purpose in work, creativity, and relationships. But every answer I gave was filtered through their fear. If I said morality comes from empathy, they heard rebellion. If I said death is final, they heard despair. If I said life can be meaningful without heaven, they heard arrogance. It was like speaking two different languages. That first night ended without resolution. I didn't convince them, and they didn't convince me. But something important changed. The silence was broken. They now knew who I really was, and I no longer had to pretend. It was painful, but it was also freeing. And in the days that followed, I thought about why it felt so heavy. Families tie belief to identity so tightly that losing one feels like losing the other. To them, my disbelief meant losing me. But to me, disbelief meant finally becoming myself. That's the paradox of leaving faith in a religious family. They see loss where you feel gain. They see betrayal where you feel honesty. They see danger where you feel freedom. And the gap between those perspectives can feel impossible to bridge. After that first conversation, the atmosphere in the family shifted. It wasn't open hostility, but it wasn't comfortable either. There was a tension, like an invisible line had been crossed, and nobody quite knew how to walk back to where we'd been before. Every casual mention of faith at the dinner table now carried a weight, because my silence or my words were suddenly significant. Sometimes they'd ask small questions, as if testing the waters. Do you really not believe at all? Not even in something? It wasn't just curiosity, it was desperation. Because for them, faith wasn't optional. It was the framework of reality itself, and the thought that someone they loved had stepped outside of it was terrifying. For me, it was exhausting. I had to balance honesty with patience because every word could be heard as an attack. Even when I simply described how I thought about life, it was taken as a rejection of their entire worldview. That's the strange thing about leaving belief. You don't just stop believing, you inherit the role of the outsider, the one who challenges the story without even trying. One of the hardest moments came when I was asked directly, "Do you think we're wrong?" It's a question loaded with emotion because it's less about ideas and more about identity. To them, hearing me say yes would mean I saw their entire lives as misguided, and yet to say no would be dishonest. So I said something else. I said, "I think you believe what feels true to you, but I don't think it matches reality." That answer didn't soothe them, but it was honest without being cruel. And honesty mattered to me more than comfort, because for too long I had played along just to keep the peace. What struck me was how quickly the conversation turned from belief to fear. What happens after you die then? Aren't you scared? These weren't intellectual questions, they were survival questions. Religion had trained them to see disbelief as hopelessness, as despair, and it revealed how much of belief is rooted not in evidence, but in fear of what happens without it. I started noticing that fear in other places too. Family members who were normally confident became anxious when I talked about morality without God. They wanted guarantees, a rule book, a divine referee, some assurance that people wouldn't fall into chaos without faith. But when I pointed out that plenty of people without religion live moral, compassionate lives, it didn't land. They had been taught that morality without God is impossible, so my existence became a contradiction they couldn't process. In those moments, I realized something. Leaving religion doesn't just change how you see the world, it forces everyone around you to confront their own assumptions. My disbelief became a mirror they didn't want to look into, because if I could live with meaning and morality outside of faith, then their certainty wasn't as certain as it seemed. And that was scarier to them than the thought of hell itself. That's one of the hidden costs of telling your family. It's not just your burden, it becomes theirs, and some will cling harder to their faith just to defend against the threat of doubt. At the same time, I learned to set boundaries. I wasn't interested in endless debates where the goal was to convert me back. I made it clear that my disbelief wasn't up for negotiation, but I was willing to talk, to listen, to explain, as long as the conversations weren't attacks disguised as concern. Sometimes those boundaries were respected, other times they weren't. There were moments when guilt was used as a weapon. "Don't you care what this does to your mother?" Or when threats were implied. "What if you're wrong and face judgment?" These tactics hurt, but they also revealed something deeper. The people using them weren't trying to manipulate out of malice. They were doing it out of fear. Fear taught by the very system they were trying to defend. Understanding that didn't excuse it, but it helped me respond with patience instead of anger. Because the real opponent wasn't my family. It was the framework of belief that shaped their fear. Over time, something unexpected happened. While some conversations were tense, others opened new doors. A sibling admitted they had doubts too, but never felt safe voicing them. A cousin confessed they struggled to reconcile science with scripture. Even my parents, though firmly rooted in their faith, began asking questions they had never said out loud before. That's the quiet ripple effect of honesty. By stepping outside the silence, I created space for others to do the same. Not everyone will take that step, but just knowing someone they love did can make the path less frightening. Looking back, I don't regret telling them. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase conflict, but it replaced pretense with truth. And truth, even when it hurts, is a better foundation than silence. Because silence keeps you trapped in a role that isn't yours, while truth, however messy, sets you free. One of the things I didn't expect after telling my family was how much it changed the small, everyday moments. Before, faith was a backdrop I played along with, saying grace at meals, nodding during religious conversations, attending ceremonies without complaint. After I came out as an unbeliever, every one of those moments felt different. When grace was said, eyes sometimes flicked toward me, checking if I'd bow my head. During sermons at family events, I felt the weight of being the one who didn't nod in agreement. When hymns were sung at weddings or funerals, my silence felt louder than the music. It wasn't that anyone directly confronted me in those moments. It was the unspoken awareness that I no longer belonged to the shared story. At first, it was isolating. I felt like I was standing in a room full of people singing the same song, and I was the only one without the lyrics. But gradually, I realized that the discomfort was part of being authentic. Belonging built on pretense wasn't real belonging, and I'd rather be honest and alone than accepted for pretending. Family gatherings became a balancing act. Some relatives ignored my unbelief entirely, as if pretending it wasn't real would make it go away. Others brought it up constantly. as though every interaction had to circle back to faith. And then there were the in-between moments, where subtle remarks carried more meaning than the words themselves. "We're praying for you" didn't just mean kindness. It meant, "We hope you'll change back." I tried to meet these reactions with understanding, but also with clarity. I didn't lash out when people prayed for me, but I didn't pretend it made sense either. I thanked them for caring, while making it clear that my choices weren't up for negotiation. Over time, this approach carved out a space where my lack of belief wasn't always the main topic, but it was always acknowledged. What surprised me was how much resilience it took, not in grand debates, but in the constant small pressures, the sideways glances, the subtle comments, the half-joking remarks about coming back to God. It wasn't one big confrontation. It was dozens of tiny ones, each testing the strength of my resolve. One particularly difficult moment came when a close relative said, with tears in their eyes, "I'm scared you won't be with us in heaven." That sentence revealed the emotional cost of disbelief in a religious family. For them, my honesty didn't just mean difference in opinion. It meant eternal separation. To them, my rejection of faith looked like self-destruction. There was no easy way to respond. I couldn't promise them heaven because I didn't believe in it. I couldn't argue them out of their fear in that moment because it was too raw. So I chose compassion. I said, "I'm here with you now, and that matters more to me than anything." It didn't erase their fear, but it shifted the focus back to the present, the real, the tangible. Moments like that made me realize that disbelief isn't just intellectual, it's relational. When you stop believing, you're not just changing your own worldview, you're forcing everyone around you to face the gap between your reality and theirs. And that gap can feel like loss, even when what's really happening is honesty. Over time, I started noticing who could accept my unbelief and who couldn't. Some family members surprised me with quiet support. They didn't share my views, but they respected them. They asked thoughtful questions. They listened without trying to convert me. They acknowledged my autonomy. Those relationships deepened because they were now built on honesty rather than assumption. Others struggled more. They avoided me during discussions about faith, or tried harder to pull me back in. They sent articles, books, sermons, as if one perfect argument would undo years of questioning. I realized then that some people can't separate love from conversion. To them, caring about me meant trying to save me. Learning to navigate those dynamics took patience. I had to remind myself that their attempts, even when frustrating, often came from fear and love tangled together. But I also had to remind myself that my autonomy mattered. I didn't owe anyone belief just to ease their discomfort. As the months passed, I noticed something else. While the initial shock of my unbelief faded, the respect grew slowly. At first, family members assumed I'd eventually come back. But when I didn't, and when I lived in a way that still reflected kindness, responsibility, and integrity, some of the fear softened. I didn't argue them into accepting me. I simply lived. I showed up for family. I supported them in hard times. I celebrated their successes. I mourned losses with them. And gradually, actions spoke louder than disbelief. They began to see that morality and meaning weren't tied to religion after all. That realization didn't fix everything. There are still gaps, still moments of tension, still differences that can't be bridged. But there's also more honesty, more respect, more authenticity than before, and that to me is worth the struggle. As time went on, I realized telling my family I was an atheist wasn't a single event. It was an ongoing process. The first conversation broke the silence, but every new interaction became another chapter in the story. Holidays, birthdays, funerals, weddings, each occasion brought its own challenges. At funerals, the hardest part was listening to endless assurances about the afterlife. "They're in a better place," people would say. "We'll see them again one day." For me, grief felt heavier, but also more honest. I wasn't comforted by visions of heaven, but I found comfort in remembering the person as they were, in the life they lived, in the moments we shared. That difference set me apart, but it also made my grief feel real instead of borrowed from a script. At weddings, when vows included promises before God, I silently reflected on how commitment gains more weight when it's chosen without eternal threats or rewards. Promises mean more when they're grounded in love here and now, not enforced by divine oversight. These were thoughts I rarely spoke out loud, but they deepened my conviction that my path, while difficult, was authentic. Conversations about parenting became another battleground. Relatives worried about what values I would pass on if I didn't raise children in the faith. They asked how kids could learn right from wrong without scripture, or what would guide them without God. My answer was simple: empathy. teaching children to consider how their actions affect others, to think critically, to care about fairness and kindness. These principles don't require religion. They require reflection and compassion. I explained that morality isn't about fearing punishment or chasing reward, but about understanding consequences and valuing people. That answer unsettled some family members because it challenged the idea that morality is handed down from above. But over time, they couldn't deny the evidence. They saw kids raised outside strict faith who were kind, thoughtful, and responsible, and kids raised inside strict faith who struggled with guilt, fear, or judgment. Reality itself began to challenge the assumptions they'd held for so long. One of the most striking forms of hypocrisy I noticed was how often believers themselves bent or ignored their own rules. Family members who condemned others for sin quietly made exceptions when it came to their own behavior. People who preached forgiveness held grudges for years. Those who insisted morality came only from God sometimes acted with less kindness than people who claimed no faith at all. Pointing this out directly rarely helped. It usually triggered defensiveness, excuses, or appeals to nobody's perfect. But quietly observing it reinforced my decision. If religion couldn't even inspire consistent morality in its most devoted followers, why should I believe it held a monopoly on truth? It became clearer that morality wasn't tied to belief, it was tied to humanity, and the more I lived authentically without faith, the more obvious that truth became. Through all of this, I had to confront my own fears too. Telling family was one challenge, but living openly afterward brought new anxieties. What if relationships broke beyond repair? What if I was quietly excluded from traditions, conversations, or decisions? What if I became the cautionary tale whispered about to children? Don't be like them. Some of those fears came true in small ways. There were subtle exclusions, strained silences, even rumors spread among extended relatives. But other fears didn't. In fact, some relationships grew stronger because honesty replaced pretense. Family members who valued truth over conformity respected me more for being open, even if they disagreed. Facing those fears was difficult, but it taught me resilience. It showed me that authenticity comes with costs, but those costs are worth paying, because living as someone you're not isn't really living at all. Over time, the dynamic settled into something new. Not perfect, not free of conflict, but real. My family didn't all accept my unbelief, but they learned to live with it. And I learned that telling them wasn't about winning arguments or changing their minds. It was about claiming my own voice. Looking back, I see that the hardest part wasn't the theology or the debates. It was the emotional weight of stepping outside the story my family lived in. They saw me as risking eternal loss, while I saw myself as stepping into honesty. That gap will never fully close, but it doesn't need to. What matters is that I chose to live authentically, and they chose, in their own way, to keep loving me despite the differences. And that's the strange balance of telling your family you're an atheist. It hurts, it divides, it challenges, but it also clarifies, it strengthens, it frees. You trade comfort for honesty, pretense for truth, silence for voice, and while the path isn't easy, it's real. And that makes all the difference. The longer I lived openly as an atheist, the more I realized that telling my family was not just about one moment of honesty. It was about reshaping every part of our relationship. Faith had always been the unspoken bond, the silent agreement tying us together. When that disappeared, we had to rebuild on something else. Love, respect, shared history, and the willingness to keep showing up for each other. In some ways, it made our bond stronger, because when someone knows the truth about you and they choose to stay in your life, that's more meaningful than any bond built on illusion. It meant my family's love was tested, and in many cases, it proved real. It wasn't love for who they thought I was, it was love for me as I am. Not every relationship survived. Some relatives drifted away, unable to reconcile my unbelief with their worldview. That hurt, but it also clarified what relationships were genuine. In a way, leaving faith didn't just free me from dogma, it freed me from conditional relationships, and that made the ones that remained even more valuable. One of the most surprising lessons I learned is that respect grows slowly, often through example rather than argument. I didn't convince my family of my worldview through debates or evidence. What shifted their perception was the simple fact that I kept living with integrity. I cared for others, I supported them, I honored commitments, I lived morally without needing a higher power to watch over me. Over time, they saw with their own eyes that my life wasn't empty, hopeless, or chaotic. It was grounded, meaningful, and full of love. That didn't erase their beliefs, but it challenged their assumptions. It showed them that disbelief wasn't the disaster they had been taught to fear. In the end, my life itself became the argument, not because I set out to prove anything, but because actions speak louder than doctrine. and that was more effective than any debate could have been. The journey also taught me patience. Change doesn't happen quickly when it comes to deeply held beliefs. My family didn't wake up the next day suddenly understanding me. It took years of conversations, silences, tensions, reconciliations. It took persistence to keep being honest, even when it felt easier to stay quiet. It took resilience to endure criticism without shutting down, and compassion to recognize their fear, even when it came out as judgment. There were setbacks along the way, moments where old arguments resurfaced, or where emotions ran high and patience wore thin. But progress isn't linear. It's messy, uneven, full of steps forward and backward, and learning to live with that messiness was part of the process. In some ways, the hardest part wasn't their resistance. It was learning not to measure my worth by their acceptance. I had to remind myself that their beliefs about me didn't define me. My authenticity did. Another realization was how common my experience really was. Once I opened up to friends and communities outside my family, I discovered countless others who had gone through the same struggle. Some had been disowned, some had lost everything, others had found unexpected support. The details differed, but the core was the same: stepping out of silence into honesty and facing the fallout. That connection mattered. It showed me that my story wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger pattern, and that gave me strength. Because when you know others have walked the same path, endured the same pain, and come out the other side, it makes your own struggle feel less lonely. And it reminded me that honesty isn't just personal, it's communal. Every time someone speaks their truth, it makes it easier for the next person to do the same. My story wasn't just mine. It was part of something bigger. Looking back, telling my family I was an atheist was one of the most difficult choices of my life, but also one of the most important. It cost me comfort, certainty, and some relationships, but it gave me honesty, authenticity, and freedom. And those are worth more than anything I lost. In the end, what I learned is that love and respect can survive even the deepest differences, but only if honesty is present. Pretending would have kept the peace on the surface, but it would have hollowed me out inside. Speaking the truth was painful, but it made real connection possible. And that's the paradox. Leaving faith can feel like losing everything, but in reality, it can be the start of living fully. The fear, the tension, the pain, all of it is the price of freedom. And freedom, once you taste it, is worth every cost.